what if I told you that a simple HR audit could protect your company from potential lawsuits? It could help you reduce turnover risk, which would save you thousands and thousands of dollars. And it could overall make your business a place where employees love to come to work. This sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? Well, in today's episode, I'm going to unpack for you what an HR audit does. I'm going to tell you why it's important for businesses of all sizes, big or small. And I'm also going to help you learn how to take action to improve your workplace environment so that in turn, your employees are more engaged, which translates to better business results. And this is something that companies don't do often enough, but when it is done right, it can drastically transform how we hire, manage, and retain employees. We'll cover what an audit is, the key areas of an audit, the benefits of an audit, and most importantly, how to turn your audit results into an action plan that drives success for your organization. So whether you are an HR leader, a business owner, or someone in the workplace who just cares about doing things the right way, this episode is for you. I have to be honest, as a human resources consultant, when people hear the phrase HR audit, they tend to shriek back and think, ooh, I'm a little nervous of what is going to come from it. So just the word audit alone can have a negative connotation that can make people apprehensive to have someone come into their business, kind of peel back the curtain and see what's happening. But I also know through all the audits that I've done that this is the single most important initiative that a business can do to start taking the people side of the business to the next level. So HR audits tend to have a reputation of being scary and overwhelming. And that's because people really believe that they're a gotcha. But a true HR consultant wants to help you improve all aspects of the people side of the business, not just the compliance part. And so when an audit is looked at from a different perspective, employers and business owners can start to see the value that it can provide. So instead of thinking of it in a scary way, I want to say one sentence that encompasses what an HR audit is. And that is, an HR audit is a deep dive into how well your company manages and supports its employees. Before I dive in, I'm going to tell you what prompted me to have an episode about human resources audits. And that is, I have been working closely with several companies, one of which I invited the general manager to be a guest on my podcast. And after recording his interview, I realized that many people don't even know what an audit is, or they maybe have a preconceived idea of what it is. And so before I air that episode with him, I want to give you a preview into what started my working relationship with this company. The first thing I want you to know is that an HR audit goes beyond compliance. In fact, there are two different types of HR audits. One is solely a compliance audit that looks at legal compliance, and it also looks at pay compliance and OSHA, EEOC, and things like this. That is one kind of audit. The second kind is a strategic audit. And this is where we look at all parts of the HR business. Culture, it could be hiring, it could be training, onboarding, giving feedback, performance reviews. It could just be anything besides compliance. Well, in my opinion, it is best to do both of these at one time. A company that is compliant doesn't necessarily mean that it's a great place to work. And a great place to work could be at risk if they're not compliant. So I bundle these two types of audits together, and I actually try not to call it an audit. I call it a human resources assessment, because that's truly what I'm doing. I'm just coming in and assessing the business from a people side and providing recommendations. So with that, throughout this episode, I am still going to call it an HR audit because that is the industry standard term. But for my preference, I like to call it an assessment. It's just a little bit less scary. So now that we know what an HR audit is, how often should a business conduct one? And my answer for that is really every 2 to 3 years. And that is because laws change, your employee culture changes in a few years, your goals change. And so it's good to revisit it. But I will actually tell you, every company that I have ever done an audit on, I have been their first audit. They hadn't thought of doing one before. And so then they will continue with me every couple of years because now they understand the importance of it and they've seen the transformation that can happen in their culture. So your first audit is so important, and then repeating them every 2 to 3 years to make sure you're compliant and that your culture is moving in a positive direction is so important. Another common question I get is, why should I do an audit, or what triggers an audit for human resources? And sometimes we can think about fear of not being compliant. And that is sometimes why people call. They'll be like, I'm not sure we're doing things the right way, and I just want to double check. So that can be a common reason. Another one is that the company is growing. And when we grow in number of employees, or when we grow in locations, things like that, that can affect compliance. So when a company is nearing 50 employees, they have to provide FMLA. And there are different laws that relate to companies of different sizes and different geographical locations. So that can sometimes spark an audit. Another reason is that the company has received a lot of employee complaints, or there's high turnover, and they're just trying to get to the bottom of what is causing this. And lastly, leadership changes. Oftentimes, somebody comes into a company and they're a new leader, either in the HR department or leader of the company in general. And they're like, I just want to get a fresh perspective and a professional's view of how we're doing on the people side. So a lot of different things can trigger an audit. It could be that they were recently fined for something. That can happen too. But for the most part, companies initiate an HR audit because they want a fresh perspective and someone who is an expert in the people side of the business to come in and diagnose how things are going. And so with that, I want to talk to you about the different areas that someone will look at when they come to audit the people side of the business. To start out with, I want to say there are about 6 main areas that we look at. And within that area, I'm going to tell you why it's important, and then just some common things that I see that happen in audits. So first thing that we will look at, and this is not going to be a surprise, the very first thing I look at is I do want to look at compliance. I do want to make sure that the company is unintentionally not breaking any laws. I can honestly say I've never in my experience seen a company purposely breaking a law, but sometimes they don't know what they don't know. So looking at compliance is really important to do. And I do that first. I want to get that over with. And it's not a gotcha. Again, I'm not going to go report information back to the Department of Labor or the EEOC or anything like that. A HR consultant, when they come in, they are there to just provide you information and provide recommendations. There is absolutely no gotcha factor involved. So with compliance, I look at labor laws, wage and hour laws, discrimination, things like that. And some of the reason that this is so important is to avoid fines, right? And avoid being in court for something, a disgruntled employee or an EEOC type violation. So those are some reasons why it's so important to get the compliance and the legal side right. Now, some common areas that I often see when I'm in an audit is that there's misclassification of employees. So what do I mean by that? I mean that companies don't often understand the difference between coding a job as exempt and non-exempt. And so what they do is, again, unintentionally classify a job as exempt when it should be non-exempt or vice versa. And that is something that is important to get right because it also affects payroll law. So that is a common thing. I often see missing I-9 forms and just outdated labor law posters, things like that. So that is the first area that I look at. The second area is HR policies and procedures. And this could be interpreted as really the employee handbook. Oftentimes, employers will have a handbook, but it's super outdated. And sometimes they've had them written by a lawyer, which I'm not dissing, but they tend to miss that HR input as well. And so if a company has a outdated old handbook, they should focus on improving it and updating it. So when I'm looking at handbooks, I'm looking to make sure that it really covers everything that it needs to cover. We had a new pregnancy law come into effect last year. I want to make sure it's in there. I want to make sure that if they have grown and they have a new compliance law that they have to follow, like FMLA, things like that, I want to make sure that it's updated and it's in there as the company has grown. If they have a new location, a new geographic location. So I have a company who just acquired another company in another state. So that would trigger a new policy manual. And so I look at that. I look to see if it's relevant, if it's up to date, if it includes everything that it should have. Because when we don't have clear policies, we increase the risk for legal issues, but also we just increase the risk for misunderstanding. And that can cause people to process situations and try to figure them out way more than they need to. And I like to say if a company doesn't have a strong employee manual, it's actually a distraction to the workplace, because when they have clear guidelines and roads to show them the way and how things should be done consistently, it enables people to focus on their day job and not really have to worry about what the guidelines are. So that's something I look at. I also look to see if the policies are old or if they're missing things. Or lastly, I also look to see if the manual and the policies reflect the company culture. Are they written in a way that you feel really proud of and their employees feel good reading, or are they written as all disciplinary? So I do look at tone as well. Next is talent acquisition and onboarding. So we're kind of moving on from the compliance part and the policy part into what I consider the fun part. And this is strategy. It really can impact the bottom line for your organization, and it can impact employee morale and engagement. So the next one I'm going to talk about is talent acquisition and onboarding. So when we think of hiring, we tend to think of interviewing. And there's so much more to employee acquisition. It starts with recruiting and making sure you have a recruiting budget, that you are recruiting in a smart way and you're not wasting money on ads that don't work. And it also starts with having a staff who is trained on how to do interviews. So that helps you legally, and it also helps you learn to assess for the right thing. This includes job descriptions. This includes an employee interview process that is well thought out, includes offer letters and onboarding. All of those things go into the audit for this part of the business. And when I look at this, I'm looking for things that would not be efficient, right? So if a company is using an old job description and they're interviewing and posting an old job description, that has huge effects on the company. It's going to make it harder to hire. It's going to make the position open longer. It's going to cause frustration. And then when that person gets hired, they're given an outdated job description. So it's setting them up for failure day one. So I look at all of those kinds of things. And I want to tell you a story here about a company I did an audit on. So this is actually the first HR audit I ever did after I founded my business. And when I was assessing the talent acquisition and onboarding part of their organization, I was also looking at like how they had spent their money when they were recruiting, like ads and things like that. And I was looking at time to fill, like how long was a job open? And I found that they had had a job posted for 687 days, almost 2 years, and they didn't even know it. So they were paying for this ad for such a long time because they had posted the job and somebody new had taken over recruiting and they didn't know the job was posted. So it just stayed up on Indeed for almost 2 years. So just that one finding saved the company so much money. And so I look at all types of things. And again, it's just that fresh perspective. All right, so let's move on to performance management and employee development. This is another area of HR that I would consider so much fun because it has a direct link to employee success. So when I look at performance management and employee development, I look at reviews. I look at the review form. Is it working? Is it outdated? Are we really doing performance reviews or do we say we're doing them? I think that's a common thing. And companies will say, yes, we do reviews every January. But when I look in a file, oftentimes I don't see the review. And so I look at for things like that and consistency. I look at how we're training our staff beyond onboarding, like what skills are we helping them sharpen to do their jobs better? I look at career growth opportunities, and I really focus on whether employees understand the goals that they personally have and how they tie into the goals of the overarching company. So that is really what I'm looking for. And some common things I see in this area is lack of structured reviews. Like I said, like I think companies think they're doing performance reviews, but whether they're doing them well or not is a whole nother topic. I also look to make sure that managers are trained to give feedback. When managers are not trained to give feedback, they tend to avoid it. And that's missed opportunity for helping an employee improve and grow. Also, in this section of the audit, I like to tell companies about the latest news out there when it comes to performance reviews, which is quarterly versus annually. And I like to help them with ideas on elevating the process so that it is actually executed correctly. So it's one thing to have a process. It's a whole nother thing, like I said, to make sure it's working. So we're halfway through an audit. I've got 3 more sections to tell you, and I'm going to dive into workplace culture and employee engagement. We know that employee engagement globally and in the US is at an all-time low. It's worse than pre-pandemic time. And so we went through a pandemic where we knew that employee morale was low and employee engagement. And now, a few years out from it, it hasn't gotten better. In fact, employee engagement has gotten worse. So I love when a company has me do an audit because we can look at this section of culture and engagement and really see what's working and where we can improve. It's so important to take a deep dive into this section because it affects retention, it affects productivity, and again, the company reputation. When you think about reputation, you may think about customers and what the customers think of a company, but you also want to think about your employer brand. Like, what do people think of when they think of applying for a job at your company or working at your company? What we want is for when people think about what it might be like to work for your company, we want your reputation to be very strong. So some common issues in this section that I often uncover is low morale, lack of feedback channels. So what that means is like, are we doing one-on-ones? Are they effective? Are we doing town halls or employee surveys? What kind of feedback channels does the company have to assess culture? So that part is huge. And lastly, I often find that the workplaces that don't have a good feedback loop where they can find out what's going on have little pockets of drama that just distract from the work that we have people doing. And so those pockets of toxicity or drama can really cause low employee engagement. All right, next is compensation and benefits. This is huge because it does tie into compliance a little bit, but it also is a common area where we see things that are just super outdated. And that makes sense. A company doesn't often take a fresh look at compensation and benefits. But when we come in and take a fresh look, I'm looking for things like pay equity. I'm looking at bonus structures, benefit offerings. And this is important because we want to make sure that your company has competitive pay and benefits. And when we have that, it keeps employees motivated. And so this is something that we look at from a pay transparency perspective. I help you determine what the laws are for pay transparency in your state and help you to decide if what you're offering is competitive, because sometimes we are losing employees because of pay and benefits, and we're underestimating the cost of turnover. When if we did update our pay and benefits program, it might actually help us retain people. And so we'll actually save money in the end. So I just look at, are you updated? Do you have a benefits program that attracts people? Do you know what your employees want as far as benefits? It's really changing over time. Generations want different benefits. And so the Gen Z and the millennials might want different benefits than you're currently offering. And so this is just a good time to take a deep dive and see if it's working for you. And some big issues I see in this section are outdated benefits packages, like I said, and lack of transparency, and then just pay gaps where it doesn't necessarily look like it makes sense to me when I'm seeing what your employees get paid. There could be like somebody who's really high and somebody who's really low that does the same job. And so I look at gaps like that to see if I can make some sense of how we're deciding how we pay people. Last but not least part of the audit is HR technology and data security. It's very important for a lot of reasons. One of the things that I look at is whether the company has an HRIS system, which stands for HR Information System. And this is the technology that supports hiring and onboarding and putting people through the process, where employees would log their time off, where you would have employee communication. This is imperative for a company as companies are growing, because it's easier to communicate and to standardize how we do things with the people side of the business when we have an effective HRIS. So I come in and I help you assess if you need one, and if you have one, if it's the right one. And then lastly, if you do need one, I will help you kind of figure out how to start looking for one. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is data privacy. I want to make sure that your employee files, if they are still paper, they're locked up, that you aren't keeping files too long, that you know what to do if you were to get an audit from some agency in the government, etc. So this part of the audit just, again, makes sure that you are up to date and relevant and that you don't have any cybersecurity issues, etc. So now I've covered the different parts of an audit. Why do HR audits matter? What are the benefits to doing this? So oftentimes companies will be reactive and wait for things to get pretty bad before they will say, gosh, we should have some help come in. It's no secret that it's actually easier and cheaper to prevent problems than it is to try to fix them later. So the most important benefit I can say is that you are doing one to be proactive, and that will always set you up for success, no question. The next thing is that you have a risk of not doing an audit, and that is the legal penalties, the high turnover, and the weak company culture. If you haven't had anyone take a look behind the curtain in your organization, you could be missing things, and the things you're missing could impact your overall business results. You can make more money as a company when you put the people side first. And so having an audit just kickstarts that. The next thing is it can save you money for the business. Remember when I told you that one of the first things I saw was that this company had been paying for an ad for almost 2 years? Well, I have to be honest. They paid more by that one mistake than they paid me to come in and do the audit. So right there, I paid for myself. And so it can help you reduce legal risks and help you reduce cost. And more importantly, it can help you increase HR efficiency when you know you're doing things the best way that you can. So that is a clear benefit. I will also tell you that sometimes a company will not have an HR leader in place when they're smaller. And that makes sense. I totally support that. Until you get like 50 to 75 employees, most companies don't have a full-time HR person. And even when a company has 100 employees, sometimes they don't have a full-time HR person. So having an audit is also a chance to educate whoever's doing the HR function, because somebody's doing it. Whether you have HR or not, if you have employees, you're doing HR. And so it's very helpful to use it as an educational tool before you hire an HR expert. So just over a year ago, I did an audit for a company who was, how I described earlier, a company who was growing. And as they were growing, they just wanted to make sure that they weren't missing anything. Nothing was wrong. And in fact, they have a fantastic company culture. But they were like, we don't know what we don't know. Could you come in and do an audit for us? And so when I did, one of the first things I asked in the talent acquisition section was, tell me about your hiring. And they said, well, Kyle hires. And I was like, okay, but you guys have close to 50 employees. So Kyle hires everybody? And they nodded. Yes, Kyle hires everybody. And I was like, but Kyle's the general manager. He's got a lot of other things to do. And Kyle chimes in and he said, it's just always been that way, Mindy. I don't think anybody else wants to hire. And so I've just always done it. And I said, you know what? If we can free you up from hiring and interviewing every person, what would you use your time for? And Kyle said, gosh, I do so many other things for the business. I would do strategic efforts. I would grow the business, etc. Well, as you're going to hear in the interview I do with Kyle following this episode, he no longer hires people. He doesn't interview unless the person reports directly to him. And even better, his team loves to hire now. And they're equipped, they're trained, and they know exactly how to do it. So I just want to share that little success that has really freed up Kyle's time, empowered his team to be part of the hiring decision and actually to make hiring decisions, and then also equipped those team members that he has to gain that skill of how to interview and select someone. And that's a skill that will benefit them throughout their career. So just a success story I really wanted to share. And just little things like that can make such a big difference in how a leader is spending their time, empower team members, and just make a huge difference in how people are spending their time. Increasing efficiency is always a benefit that comes from an audit. So what can you expect as a direct impact from an audit to employee experience and retention? And I want to say that you will see results quite quickly. And this is because when you share with your team that you have brought somebody in to talk about the people side of the business and elevate it, that decision right there helps people to see that you take it seriously. And that's the first step in improving the employee experience, is knowing that the leadership takes it seriously. Then when they start to see changes that are made, they can start to see again that you're committed. So companies that have started with small change and over time continually improved their company culture have been able to tell me that employee engagement has increased. So what happens after the audit is finished? Well, I'm imagining other HR consultants do the same thing as me, and that is take all of my findings and study them. I look for patterns, I look for suggestions, I look for compliance issues, I look for what's working really well, and I go back and I prepare a report for the company. And I prioritize the report in 3 different ways. So the first thing that I talk about when I then present my findings to the leadership team in HR, the very first thing I talk about is what legally has to be changed, right? So whether or not they do things that are not legal, that's a whole different story, but they need to fix quickly whatever is broken from a legal compliance perspective. So that's the first thing I share. And I'm going to be honest, it's not often that there are a lot of legal things broken. I think people are more scared than they need to be. Most of the time, the compliance piece is better than companies think it will be. So, but that's where I start, because that's what people want to know. They want to know, are we doing things okay, or are we at risk? And so I get that out on the table right away. The next thing that I do is I take the list of all of my suggestions and I prioritize them by which things could they do soon that would have the biggest impact. So biggest impact to employee morale, biggest impact to the bottom line, biggest impact to efficiency. I look at all of them and I prioritize then, now that we've made things legal, what things can we do in priority order to improve the people side of the business. And I start at the things that I think will be most impactful, and I go down to the things that are more nice to do's, right? And so when we go through it that way, they can see how I, as somebody who has seen a lot of different companies, how I prioritize what needs to happen. And then the last thing that we do is I share with them what they can do next. So if a company comes in and does an audit for you, you can take that audit results and fix them on your own, fix everything on your own. You can, just take their advice and run with it. Or you can then seek guidance and help for different projects or processes that you want to elevate. So as we'll hear in my interview with Kyle in the next episode, they tackled a variety of the things. First, they decided to make it a strengths-based culture and implemented Gallup strengths, which I'm a certified strengths coach, so I was able to help them with, because they wanted to have a common language for talking about what people brought to the table. Now, I will say I didn't prioritize that as the first thing, but they came back and said, you know what? Before we do anything else, we want to identify the strengths of our people. So that was the first thing they did. The next thing they did was look at all their hiring practices. Because like I said, we had one person doing all the hiring. And so we created a hiring process that empowered people to be part of the decision and honestly increase the quality of the hire. So they've been able to make some great hires this year. And each of them is still there. Each of them is doing well. And they just really feel like they've elevated their hiring. And so then I can go on. We worked on a handbook for them. We have then worked on compensation guidelines, performance reviews. This company has taken a lot on for the people side because they just kind of feel like they're on a roll and they're seeing progress. And so they just want to keep going. Other companies will say, thank you so much. Can you just help us update our employee manual? Or can you help us with employee training? There's so many different things that a company can do. So they take my priorities. And then, like I said, sometimes they'll hire me to come back. I've actually never had a company not hire me to come back and help with something. And then, like I said, I've had companies who I still work with on retainer and on a project basis to continue to elevate the people side of the business. So that's what happens next. The employer is totally in control with what they do. I give them the report. I do a presentation, I answer any questions that they have, and then I leave them to discuss what they want to do. I also like to take into account what are the easy, low-hanging fruit things that they could implement, because getting some quick wins feels good to both the company and the leaders, and it also feels good to the employees. So oftentimes there's some low-hanging fruit that we can pick to just start seeing change right away. People often ask me how to get leadership bought in to an HR audit. And the answer to that is pretty simple. If we can show leadership in an organization the impact that can be had from focusing on the people side of the business, they naturally buy in. And what I mean by that is it is a fact, and it's a slogan I use often, that people first, profits follow. And we can try to move all the levers in a company, whether it's to get more sales, to have faster service, to reduce costs, all those things. We can try to move all those levers, but when the people side of the business isn't working right, it affects the profitability of the company. So once leaders start to see that, then it's easier for them to buy into taking a deep dive in the people side. So now that you know what a human resources audit is and you know why it's so important, I have a challenge for you. I want you to take one step towards assessing how your organization is doing with the people side of the business. This could be reviewing your current employee manual to see if it's still relevant. It could be walking around and making sure labor law posters are up, or it could be starting a conversation with someone in your company about the HR strategy that you want to have. Whatever the step you take, it's a step in the right direction. I also want to tell you that I have created a free download that you can find in the show notes below. This is a self-audit that you can do on your own in your organization to assess where you are now and what things you could improve to make it an even better place to work. And lastly, if you want to do an HR audit with me, then you can find the link in the show notes below to book a free call with me, and we can talk about whether an audit is right for your organization. And then next week, I am going to be interviewing Kyle Yoder, the general manager for Metal Fab Manufacturing. And Kyle and I are going to talk about what he learned when he first did an HR audit with me. And then he's going to walk us through the things that he and his team have done this year to elevate the people side of the business. It's a great one. You are not going to want to miss it. I'd like to thank you for tuning in today, and I will see you next week.